Now let's talk about the ending. I know I'm getting ahead of myself here since we haven't even talked about the beginning of the story yet, but it's important to talk about the ending because everything that happens over the course of the story is building up to it. So if you don't know what happens at the end of Watchmen, or if you can't remember, here's what happens. Ozymandias teleports a giant alien squid vagina monster into the city of Manhattan. He's doing this so he can unite the United States and the Soviet Union against a common enemy, an interdimensional being with weird psychic powers. Basically, he's trying to put a stop to the Cold War, and in the end, his plan succeeds. The Americans and the Soviets put their differences aside and manage to unite for the greater good. The threat of nuclear war has come to an end, at least for the time being. This is the part of the graphic novel that really blew my mind and solidified Watchmen as my favorite book I'd ever read. It presents a very serious ethical question. Would you kill millions of people to save billions of people? But even though this is my favorite part of the graphic novel, it also presents a huge problem. How the does Ozymandias manage to teleport a giant alien squid vagina monster into Manhattan in the first place? This is the one part of the graphic novel that totally loses me. If you came up to me and asked me how Ozymandias got a hold of a psychic's brain and managed to teleport this thing from another dimension, I would be like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of people out there who don't like the giant alien squid vagina monster, and I can totally understand why. The rest of the book is so believable and grounded in reality, and then out of nowhere, here comes this weird-looking monster from another dimension or whatever. The general idea behind the monster is fine. It needed to be something from another world so the Americans and the Soviets could unite against a common enemy. It's basically telling people that there's some freaky-deaky shit out there in the cosmos, and whatever differences we have are pretty petty in comparison to whatever else might be out there, just waiting to strike at any given moment. So while the general idea is fine, it's the execution behind this idea that's sloppy, but I can understand what Alan Moore was going for, and why he introduced something like this into the story. The people who made the movie clearly did not like the alien rape monster because it's erased from existence, and I can totally understand why they erased it from existence. The idea of teleporting this thing is convoluted, even in a comic book format. If a graphic novel that spans over 90,000 words can't explain this thing properly, then there's no way a movie could ever explain it properly. So instead, Ozymandias releases Dr. Manhattan's energy and uses it to wipe out entire cities across the globe. Not just Manhattan, but other major cities like LA, Hong Kong, and Beijing. Instead of a few million people dead like in the graphic novel, now there's like 15 million people dead. This is so he can convince the rest of the world to unite against a common enemy, in this case Dr. Manhattan. Hypothetically, this would be a great idea. Ozymandias can have the same plan he did in the graphic novel, while still being able to simplify it for your average movie-going audience. It's much less convoluted than the whole alien rape monster thing, but it doesn't make any sense. The movie very clearly shows that Dr. Manhattan was working for the United States military. Like the guy on the news says, the Superman is real and he's American. Dr. Manhattan is not an extraterrestrial or interdimensional being. He's an American citizen first and foremost. So if Ozymandias used Dr. Manhattan's energy to wipe out entire cities, this would do nothing but get people pissed off at the United States. The fact that they would let Dr. Manhattan run free after all these years and give people cancer and basically do whatever he wants without even trying to stop him would not reflect well on the US at all. If anything, it would only plunge them even further into war. But for some reason, everyone puts their differences aside and decides to unite against Dr. Manhattan. But how the hell are they going to stop Dr. Manhattan? At the end of the movie, Dr. Manhattan says he's leaving for another galaxy. So what are they going to do? Are they going to send their space nukes to another galaxy and wait thousands of years for it to try and destroy him? What if Dr. Manhattan comes back to Earth? How are they prepared to deal with him? Are they going to shoot him with missiles and hope it does something to hurt him? I mean, Dr. Manhattan did banish himself to Mars. At that point, it sure seemed like he was revoking his US citizenship, so maybe they wouldn't consider him an ally of the United United States after all. And I can kind of understand why the whole world has joined forces. All of their major cities have just been wiped out after all. But I don't know. To me, it just seems like it would lead to more conflict and more finger pointing and more he said, she said between all the different countries. So in other words, by trying not to make Ozymandias' plan convoluted, the writers have somehow managed to make it even more convoluted. I didn't even know that was possible. It's also worth pointing out that the way they explain Ozymandias' master plan in the movie is very sloppy. First, Rorschach and Night Owl discover Ozymandias is behind everything. Then they discover he's come up with some sort of plan to kill millions of people. Then Ozymandias says he did it to save billions of people. Then the city of Manhattan gets destroyed. Then Laurie and Dr. Manhattan show up. Then everybody tries to fight Ozymandias again. And then, at the very, very end, we find out why Ozymandias has done all this, so he could convince people to join forces against Dr. Manhattan. The reason why he did all this should have been explained a lot sooner, before Laurie and Dr. Manhattan even show up. There should have been a scene where Ozymandias explains his whole master plan to Rorschach and Night Owl, just like in the graphic novel. But instead, the revelation of his master plan comes at the very, very end of the movie, which is very, very confusing. Up until this point, we're kind of just like, huh? Why is the city of Manhattan wiped out? Why is he doing this? Why is he killing millions of people? What the f***? Now let's talk about how violence is used in the Watchmen movie. I know this is a weird subject to bring up, but this is one of the major issues I have with the movie. In the first 11 chapters of the graphic novel, there's very little violence, and when there is violence, it's used very sparingly. It's not as graphic or as bloody as it probably should be. This is so when we get to chapter 12, we can be absolutely shocked and horrified by the carnage and destruction that's taken place in Manhattan. When you see chapter 12 for the first time, it's absolutely shocking and disturbing. The panels take up the entire page, which completely shatters the 9-panel format the book has been working so hard to emulate. But it would not have had the same impact if the rest of the book had been filled with graphic, bloody violence. Which brings us to the Watchmen movie, which happens to open with a graphic fight scene. It's highly choreographed and stylized, but it's still a fight scene nonetheless. When Dan and Laurie fight the gangsters in the back alley, Dan breaks some guy's arm in half. When the prisoners are trying to attack Rorschach, they cut some guy's arms off. The assassin shoots a woman's fingers off and then shoots some poor guy in the head. Rorschach decimates the pedophile's corpse with a meat cleaver. And then you get to the end of the movie when Ozymandias' plan comes together and there's no blood or death whatsoever. I mean, yeah, millions of people are still dead, but the one part of the movie that should have been shocking and disturbing ends up looking like a landscape of CGI nothingness. You can tell the actors are just standing in front of a green screen, trying to act like they know what's going on around them. You don't really see the consequences of what Ozymandias has done. This is a huge problem because it does nothing to question our sense of ethics. When we see all the dead bodies in the graphic novel, it challenges the reader to think about whether or not Ozymandias did the right thing, killing millions of people to save the rest of humanity. The way violence is used in the graphic novel is not only effective, but brilliant. Meanwhile, the way violence is used in the Watchmen movie is the same as any other comic book movie that's come out ever since. When I talk to people who don't like the Watchmen movie, this is the #1 issue almost every single one of them brings up. Making Watchmen into a stereotypical comic book movie goes against literally everything the graphic novel stood for. If anything, Watchmen was as pacifistic as you could possibly get for a superhero story. Yes, there is the threat of nuclear war, and yes, the comedian does try to rape Sally Jupiter, but when Ozymandias kills millions of people, he does so in the name of world peace. And what's really offensive is that stupid video game they came out with. Watchmen was a graphic novel that deconstructed the whole idea of good guys punching bad guys in the face, so the obvious logical step was to make a beat-em-up video game like Final Fight or Double Dragon, where good guys do nothing but punch bad guys in the face. Now, with all this being said, I can understand why they opened the movie with a graphic fight scene. The graphic novel opens with narration from Rorschach. We see the shop owner cleaning up the comedian's blood, and then we see the detectives investigating his apartment. I love the way the graphic novel opens, but this is the type of thing that only works in a comic book setting. This never would have worked in Zack Snyder's version of Watchmen. If you'd opened the movie this way, your typical movie-going audience would have been like, "Ooh, is that blood? Ew, that's gross. Wait a second, who's talking right now? Wait, what year is this? Is this like the 80s or something? Gross." Opening your movie with a fight scene is way more exciting and sets the tone for the rest of the movie. We see how strong the comedian is, and we see how much of a threat his killer is. Whoever killed the comedian, we know they're not screwing around. In fact, I think the opening scene is actually pretty clever from a filmmaking standpoint. When the comedian's sitting there watching TV, we see news footage talking about the conflict between the Americans and the Soviets. This lets the audience know we're in the year 1985, when the threat of nuclear war is ever present. This goes back to my earlier point, that when you're making a Watchmen movie, you're damned no matter what you do. You're damned if you open your movie the same way the graphic novel opens, but you're also damned if you open the movie with an exciting fight scene. When you're making a Watchmen movie, you simply can't win. So how well does the Watchmen movie hold up 10 years later? I was inspired to make this video after looking at how many freaking comic book movies have come out since 2009, when Watchmen was first released. Don't get me wrong, I'm actually a big fan of comic book movies, especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But just like in the world of Watchmen, history is repeating itself all over again. Like I mentioned earlier, Watchmen was written at a time when the comic book market was totally overblown and oversaturated. There was nothing new or innovative going on whatsoever. Comic books were an assembly line product, with issue after issue being crapped out at an alarming rate. They were basically just an excuse to sell toys and make money. The exact same thing is going on nowadays. Not with comic books, but with comic book movies. Again, the market is totally overblown and oversaturated. Again, there's nothing new or innovative going on whatsoever. Again, comic book movies are nothing but an assembly line product, designed to sell toys and make money. I'm so sick and tired of origin stories. There's so many movies that connect, and so many movies that don't connect, and so many movies that are a part of this universe but not a part of that universe, because this universe is owned by this studio and that universe is owned by that studio, that it kind of makes me want to throw up. If there was ever a time for a Watchmen movie, that time would be now. Honestly, the Watchmen movie was way ahead of its time and came out about 10 years too early. It's actually kind of crazy looking back on it now, since it came out 3 years before the first Avengers movie, when comic book movies were still trying to catch mainstream attention. A Watchmen movie in the year 2019 would be a breath of fresh air. It would be exciting simply because it would be different and something most people had never seen before. It would also redeem Zack Snyder as a director after his whole hit-and-miss streak with the Justice League movies. When Watchmen came out, it reaped a very small profit and was considered something of a bomb. Warner Brothers took a huge financial risk on the Watchmen movie, and it kind of paid off, but not really. And because of that, this is probably all we're ever going to be left with. There will probably never be another big-budget, big studio Watchmen movie ever again. And even though the movie has its problems, I'm just happy we got anything at all. Now there's going to be a Watchmen series on HBO, with Jeremy Irons playing an older version of Ozymandias. But I seriously doubt they're going to make an entire series that revolves around philosophy and ethics like the graphic novel was. Of course there's going to be action. Of course there's going to be good guys punching bad guys. Of course there's going to be tons of sex and violence. This is HBO we're talking about, the company that's going to be looking for another hit once Game of Thrones is over with. You know what? Alan Moore was right, and that's all I have to say about that.